sign on the dotted line, Miss Hastings. It is just a formality, really." Benjamin Caldwell tapped his manicured index finger against the bottom of the heavily watermarked page. He was a partner at a prestigious Boston law firm, a man whose tailored Italian suits and condescending smile suggested he was used to dealing with people of far greater importance than Clara Hastings. Clara, a 31-year-old underpaid archivist at the local historical society, stared at the document. She was drowning in student debt and 3 months behind on her rent. Yet here she was, inheriting real estate from a grandfather she had not seen since she was 7 years old. Nathaniel Hastings had always been the black sheep of her family. When Clara's parents spoke of him, which was rarely, it was always in hushed, disapproving tones. They called him a drifter, a gambler, and a man who associated with the worst kinds of people in the South Boston underground. He had died 2 weeks ago in a state-run nursing home, leaving behind a cardboard box of cheap possessions and, shockingly, the deed to a piece of land called Cormorant Isle. Caldwell slid a heavy brass pen across the mahogany desk. "It is barely an island, Clara. It is essentially a glorified sandbar off the jagged coast of Maine, about 10 miles out from Rockland. There is a ruined lobsterman's shack on it, but the soil is too salty for vegetation, and the tides frequently flood the western edge. My advice? Sell it to the state as a wildlife preserve. I can handle the paperwork for a nominal fee." Clara picked up the pen, feeling the cold metal against her skin. Something about Caldwell's eagerness rubbed her the wrong way. His eyes were entirely too sharp, entirely too focused on her signature. "I think I will go see it first," Clara said quietly, signing her name with a flourish. Caldwell's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a microscopic tightening of his jaw, before the polished veneer returned. "Suit yourself, but Maine is unforgiving this time of year. Be careful out there." 3 days later, Clara stood on the splintered wooden docks of Rockland, Maine, shivering inside her oversized wool coat. The sky above was a bruised, churning purple, threatening a brutal late autumn nor'easter. She had hired a local fisherman named Thomas Brody to take her out to Cormorant Isle. Brody was a man carved from salt and silence, missing half of his left index finger and communicating primarily through grunts. "Your grandfather was a strange bird," Brody muttered over the roar of the diesel engine as his trawler sliced through the choppy, steel-grey Atlantic. "Used to pay me double my daily rate to run him out to that rock in the middle of the night. Never let me dock. He'd take a little Zodiac inflatable the rest of the way. Always carried heavy, waterproof Pelican cases. Said he was doing meteorological research. We all knew that was a lie." Clara gripped the rusted railing of the boat, her heart hammering against her ribs. "What did you think he was doing?" "Harv," Brody spat over the side into the churning wake. "Hiding something, or hiding from someone." When Cormorant Isle finally materialized through the sea mist, it looked exactly as Caldwell had described, a bleak, desolate stretch of pale sand and jagged black rocks, crowned by a rotting wooden shack that leaned precariously against the wind. Brody dropped her off at a makeshift wooden pier that looked ready to collapse, promising to return in 6 hours before the worst of the storm hit. Clara approached the shack with cautious steps. The front door was completely gone, ripped from its hinges by years of relentless gales. Inside, the cabin smelled of decaying seaweed, rat droppings, and damp rot. The furniture was reduced to splintered kindling. She spent an hour sifting through the debris, finding nothing but rusted tin cans and a broken kerosene lantern. Frustration brought tears to her eyes. Caldwell was right. She had wasted her last few $100 coming to a worthless pile of sand. Exhausted, she slumped against the crumbling stone fireplace. As she slid down, her boot caught the edge of a loose floorboard. It didn't squeak. It echoed with a hollow, metallic thud. Clara scrambled to her knees. She used a rusted fire poker to pry the warped pine board upward. Beneath it, nestled in the dirt, was a small, oilskin-wrapped package. Her hands shook as she unrolled the thick canvas. Inside was a leather-bound ledger and a heavy, tarnished brass key. She opened the ledger. The pages were filled with her grandfather's frantic, jagged handwriting. It was not a diary. It was a map, filled with tidal charts, lunar cycles, and coordinates. The final entry, dated almost 20 years ago, made her breath catch in her throat. The sand breathes at the lowest tide of the autumn equinox. When the water retreats past the Devil's Tooth, the iron door lies naked. They think I fenced the hall for the Kalila family, but I kept the crown jewels. Let them tear Boston apart looking for it. The truth is buried in the sand. Clara looked at her watch. It was late September, the autumn equinox. She ran out of the shack and stared at the shoreline. The tide was pulling back, further than she had ever seen a body of water retreat, exposing a vast, muddy expanse of the ocean floor. A massive, jagged black rock, perfectly resembling a jagged tooth, stood, exposed about 50 yards from the normal shoreline. Adrenaline overpowered her exhaustion. She grabbed a rusted spade she had seen leaning against the back of the cabin and sprinted toward the rock. The wind was howling now, driving icy needles of rain into her face. She reached the rock and began to dig frantically at its base. The wet sand was incredibly heavy, suctioning against the metal of the shovel. For 20 minutes she dug, her muscles screaming in protest, her hands blistering. Just as she was about to give up, the metal blade struck something hard. It didn't sound like a rock. It sounded like steel. Clara dropped to her knees and dug with her bare hands, tearing away the wet, freezing sand until she uncovered a heavy, rusted iron hatch, bolted into a concrete collar that had been buried beneath the ocean floor. The brass key from the floorboards fit perfectly into the heavy padlock securing the wheel. With a groan of protesting metal, the wheel turned. Clara hauled the heavy hatch open. A blast of stale, dry air hit her face. Using her cell phone's flashlight, she peered down into a concrete shaft lined with a rusted metal ladder. She climbed down into the darkness. The shaft dropped about 20 feet before opening into a surprisingly dry, concrete-lined bunker. It was a leftover coastal defense battery from World War II, forgotten by the military and reclaimed by her grandfather. The beam of her flashlight swept across the room and stopped. Stacked against the far wall were 4 massive, military-grade, waterproof cases. Clara approached them, her hands trembling so violently she could barely operate the latches. She threw open the lid of the first case. It wasn't gold, it wasn't money. It was an assortment of thick PVC tubes, sealed with industrial wax. Clara broke the seal on one of the tubes and carefully slid out the contents. It was a canvas rolled meticulously in acid-free archival paper. She unrolled it just a few inches, shining her light onto the oil paint. Clara was an archivist. She had degrees in art history. She knew exactly what she was looking at. Staring back at her, illuminated by the harsh LED light of her phone, was the unmistakable face of Jesus Christ, terrified disciples scrambling around him in a violently tossing boat. It was Rembrandt's The Storm on the Sea of Galilee. Clara dropped the canvas as if it were on fire, stumbling backward. This was impossible. The painting had been famously stolen in 1990 from the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston, along with 12 other masterpieces. It was the greatest unsolved art heist in history, carrying a $10 million reward. And it was sitting in a rotting bunker beneath a main sandbar. She rushed to the next tube. Vermeer's The Concert. The next case held ancient Chinese goo. Her grandfather hadn't just been a low-level mob fence. He was the man who had hidden the Gardner Hall. Magnificent, isn't it? Clara whirled around, dropping her flashlight. Standing at the base of the ladder, holding a high-powered tactical flashlight and a silenced Block 19, was Benjamin Caldwell. Behind him stood a massive, heavily tattooed man whose face was a map of scar tissue. "How did you find me?" Clara whispered, her mind racing. Caldwell smiled, but there was no warmth in it now. It was the smile of a predator. "The leather folder I gave you with the deed, Clara. It has a micro GPS tracker sewn into the lining. I knew Nathaniel had stashed the Gardner Hall somewhere, but the old bastard refused to give up the location, even when my associates got creative with him in the nursing home. He died before he could talk, but I knew his will would lead the sole heir right to it. You killed him, Clara said, the horrific realization washing over her. He was dying anyway, Caldwell shrugged, stepping further into the bunker. My father was the one who orchestrated the Gardner heist. He took all the risk, and Nathaniel vanished with the prize. I spent my entire adult life trying to reclaim my family's legacy. Step away from the cases, Clara. Rare. Clara backed away, her mind working furiously. The ledger, the title charts, the water. She remembered what her grandfather had written about the tides. The bunker was dry because it was sealed, but the structural integrity of the concrete was compromised. There was a large, rusted drainage wheel on the eastern wall, meant to flood the chamber in case of an enemy breach during the war. "You can take it," Clara said, raising her hands in surrender, slowly backing toward the rusted wheel. "I don't want any part of this. Just let me go." "I'm afraid I cannot do that," Caldwell said gently. Derek put her on her knees. The tattooed man lunged forward. In that split second, Clara grabbed the rusted iron wheel on the wall and threw her entire body weight backward. The metal shrieked, gears grinding as the seal broke. The pressure of the Atlantic Ocean, held back by a single corroded valve, violently asserted itself. A massive jet of freezing, high-pressure seawater exploded into the room. It hit Derek square in the chest, throwing the 300-pound man backward into Caldwell with the force of a freight train. The gun flew from the lawyer's hand, clattering into the dark water that was now rising at a terrifying speed. The bunker became a chaotic whirlpool. Caldwell screamed as the water slammed him against the concrete wall, plunging the room into darkness as his flashlight shattered. Clara didn't hesitate. She had memorized the layout of the room and the flashes of light. She grabbed the PVC tube containing the Rembrandt, slung it over her shoulder, and fought her way through the rising, churning water toward the ladder. The water was already at her waist, freezing her muscles, pulling her down. Derek grabbed her ankle. His grip was like a vice. Clara kicked downward with her heavy leather boot, her heel connecting sickeningly with his face. He let go. She scrambled up the rusted rungs, the water surging up the shaft behind her like a hungry beast. She hauled herself out of the hatch and collapsed onto the wet sand, gasping for air. Below her, the screams of the two men were quickly silenced by the terrifying rush of millions of gallons of seawater completely flooding the subterranean chamber. Clara dragged herself away from the hole as the storm broke over the island with full fury. She staggered toward the rotting pier just as Captain Brodie's trawler cut through the massive swells, his searchlight sweeping the beach. 6 months later, a prominent Boston newspaper ran a headline that shocked the art world. An anonymous source had orchestrated the safe return of Rembrandt's The Storm on the Sea of Galilee to the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. The $10 million reward was quietly wired to an offshore account through a labyrinth of shell companies. The police also received an anonymous package containing a waterlogged leather ledger. The detailed notes inside led the FBI straight to the Caldwell law firm, exposing a decades-long money laundering and art fencing operation. Benjamin Caldwell, however, could not be reached for comment. He had simply vanished, a missing persons case that the police quietly filed away. Miles away, in a sun-drenched villa overlooking the Mediterranean Sea, Clara Hastings sat on a terrace, sipping a cup of black coffee. She watched the gentle waves lap against the shore, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face. She had traded the cold, unforgiving coast of Maine for a life of quiet luxury. No one knew who she was, and no one ever would. She looked down at a beautifully framed, small maritime landscape painting resting on the table beside her, a little piece of history she had kept just for herself. She took a slow sip of her coffee, the ghost of a smile playing on her lips. Sometimes the past refused to stay buried, but if you knew exactly where to dig, it could buy you the future.